The big question is, where does education start? Can we give any sort of date? And we now know that there was a fairly advanced numeral system in Eswatini 40,000 years ago. If you look at Aboriginal depictions of astronomy, you see a clear transmission of knowledge that must suggest some sort of educational transmission or structure. And the collective transmission of knowledge, storytelling, group tutorials inherent to hunter-gatherer culture has clearly been in place for thousands of years. And of course, it continues to operate in many cultures. However, we tend to see the origins of formal education around about the time of the great agricultural revolutions that humans experienced in the Fertile Crescent, India and China, probably about 5,000 years before the Common Era, as migratory cultures transformed into agrarian cultures and resultant political, military and class divisions became stronger. We know that there was a form of schooling under Menhotep II of Egypt, but we're looking at about 1% literacy maximum. And in Mesopotamia, by the time Babylon was a thriving city, there was clearly a syllabic system that had evolved to the point where there were literacy rates and schools. Most students would learn cuneiform through drills during the early stages of the curriculum, but few would advance to the latter stages that allowed them to master the trade of the scribe. And Persia followed a similar structure, with formal education being reserved for priests, warriors, and so on and so forth. What we're looking at here is this idea, okay, very ancient idea, that knowledge, insights are God-given and they belong to the few, not the many. Hence the master, the guru. We know in the Vedic period of India that although there was a fairly broad-based education system based on Vedic literature, sciences, grammar, logic, and traditional knowledge, it was freely available. It was conducted by, as society advanced, Brahmins, and it was for initiates, for those that would follow the spiritual path. If we fast forward to Greece, here you have Protagoras, the father of sophistry. We enter into a financial model where those with money could pay for the skills of rhetoric and persuasion. Plato in his academy famously inscribed on its entrance, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter," and Aristotle's Lyceum, although it was less elitist, was still very much premised on the idea of an education for the few. We go to the world's first university, and there's some disagreement over this, but some say it's Tassila, which is in modern-day Pakistan, about 1,000 years before the Common Era. Others think it's Nalanda in India. These are Buddhist centers that are primarily for initiates and those wishing to become priests. Bologna, Europe's first university, 1088. And this is an interesting picture because you can see some of the students are falling asleep. So we start to enter into conventional education, is nonetheless not an affair for the masses. It is still following that idea of wisdom coming from a higher source, and education really being for a kind of inner group, hence academic dress. You start to see all sorts of cultural codes that will mark the educated from the masses. And it's somewhat ironic that the tradition of what we call public schools in England, and this could be a long talk, starts with the whole idea of charity schools. So churches wished to provide an education for the poorest. And this, through time, led to schools with a formidable reputation actually becoming really schools for the wealthy. And it was after the Clarendon Report that substantial decadence and disrepute in these schools led to them being refinanced and called public schools. But everything but public, and their origins, although attached to a charity status, turned out into something very different. And hence we start to get into this modern paradigm of the extremely educated who are following what you could call a gilded path, not really being in the same universe as many others. We've all heard of the infamous elitist clubs that exist in top universities. This famous photograph here of Boris Johnson and others in the Bullion Club is showing really what I would describe as a kind of marked symbolic behavior that explicitly tears away from middle-class decency and order a kind of recklessness that we can associate with patterns of behavior in leadership caucuses historically, all the way back to Suetonius. We are reminded of the immoral behavior of Roman emperors, and famous stories are still told about sexual wildness in the gardens of the Borgias. Parallel to this, if you like, you have the grammar school, which starts with Latin and Greek schools that become sort of centers of academic excellence. But there is this tradition of them being available to those who don't have the means necessarily. The famous headmaster of Manchester Grammar School was an idealist, and he believed in an education for the brightest and the poorest. But through time, grammar schools became victims of their own success, and they started to be despised by the Labour Party, for example, because they were seen as divisive. And here's a photograph of the Secretary of Education in 1965, Anthony Crossland, who he himself attended Highgate, a public school, and then Oxford. But he did say, and here's a little quotation for you, if it's the last thing I do, I'm going to destroy every effing grammar school in England and Wales and Northern Ireland. Hence, tempers run wild when it comes to questions of elitism. We have, of course, this idea of the top tier of universities that will be the destination of those taking this gilded path. And you could argue that international schools today, which suffer something of a schizophrenia between their idealistic purpose and their administrative purpose, are a kind of new form of this gilded path leading to the world's best and most selective universities. Now, there's another type of elitism we can look at, which is, for want of a better term, cultural elitism. Here you have Harold Bloom, whose famous book on the canon talks about the essential literature needed to understand really the Western world. And he names 26 authors that everyone has to read. 22 of them are men, and all of them are white. We should talk a little bit about the economic system, of course, that's engulfed the 21st century, but really starts in the 1980s. Neoliberalism, the free market, leading to a breakaway of extremely wealthy caucuses of power and no real regulation by the government. Now, what is this all premised on? Well, you could push it back to Plato and Aristotle, but if you look at the essentially the end of the Enlightenment and the early 19th century, you have some evidence that human performance tends to fall in a normal distribution. And this influences the first IQ tests, which were designed by Alfred Binet, actually to distinguish children with learning difficulties from the rest. And the idea, therefore, is that, well, some people are at the top and some people at the bottom and some people are in the middle. And maybe there's something good about this. After all, you know, why should Usain Bolt not win the 100 meters? And do you really want your brain surgeon, your lawyer, and your pilot not to have attended the very best schools and not to live in a meritocratic society? This is meritocratic elitism, if you like. It's based on what's called the just world hypothesis, sometimes called the just world fallacy, which implies something else. The idea being that we're on a level playing ground and that all's fair and that people who achieve and do well deserve to be where they are. So what we see here is this very deep-seated archetypal notion of elitism that really informs education from the start and possibly human society since the agricultural revolution. The three types of elitism I argue in the book: meritocratic, meaning that the brightest and the best should earn their place, which is at the top; plutocratic, which is ready for the wealthy; and cultural elitism. Here are some of the architects of this way of thinking: Vilfredo Pareto and Gaetano Mosca, who really developed theories of political and philosophical elitism in the early 20th century. Matthew Arnold, we could have chosen another figure who talks about culture being the best that the world has ever produced. And we'd have to put Milton Friedman in there, along with the Chicago School of Economics, who heralds in this new plutocratic elitism, which is a strong force in the world today. But at the bottom of the Tower of Babel, what's happening? Well, slaves. What happened to those who weren't attending schools? What about women? I mean, throughout these different paradigms, if you like, of education, Women were given a substandard education, which was essentially around weaving, cookery, the arts, and dance. And we'd have to wait for a long time before women would start to really be taken seriously as students. You have, throughout the Middle Ages, the period of serfdom wasn't much of an education for them. Now, there are some exceptions. I mean, if you look at the Babylonian Talmud, this is very interesting. You read that the mythic scribe Ezra, all the way back in the 4th century before the Common Era, established a school that about 600 years later was reformed into several schools to offer free education to every child over 5. And this reform was enacted by a famous high priest called Joshua ben Gamla. So the whole sort of tradition in Judaic culture of reading the scripts, the Pentateuch, and that form of literacy becomes a sort of household expectation. Now, some would argue, like Luc Ferry, that a turning point is right here. It's the parable of the talents in the book of Matthew, New Testament, Matthew 25 precisely. So you remember the story. There are 3 servants, or 3 sons rather, that are sent off with some money, and 2 of them, they make the money grow, and 1 doesn't. And those that make the money grow are rewarded, whereas the person who doesn't is not. And the idea here is the beginning of a new ethic, which is about the talented deserving a chance. You know, for Plato, for Aristotle, the whole purpose of a school was to give the naturally endowed, the kings and the philosophers, some space where they could think deeply and be detached from the rabble. But here you have the idea that everyone has a chance to climb to the top. And what counts, what's important, it's the talent that you have and how you really make some sort of yield out of the gifts you've been given. During the Islamic Golden Age, we have madrasas across various caliphates that offer religious and scientific instruction to young scholars, irrespective of their social status. The printing press, 1444, absolutely vital, because essentially what happens is about 100 years later, you get the Bible translated into the vernacular, into German, for example, under Martin Luther. And this opens access to texts and abstract ideas that were in that sacred space of Latin and Greek, which are the languages of the clergy and the minority. And Luther actually opened schools for boys and girls and converted churches into schools. So Lutheran reformism is an important movement towards egalitarianism in education. And it might actually explain why so many Nordic countries perform well in literacy and education in general to this day. Reading, self-instruction becomes a household affair. You can access knowledge much more easily. And the dominant paradigm, you know, for much of the, or certainly the Renaissance, the Enlightenment into the beginning of the 19th century, it's the idea of having a tutor at home. Again, this suggests that you need the means to pay for this. Here you have the Peace of Westphalia, 1648, the beginning of the nation state in Europe. Now, the nation state is interesting because what it means is, well, we have to gather people around a new identity, and therefore we need to standardize the language, and we need to script a historical narrative, and that will be taught in school. School becomes a place where you form a national identity, at the loss, of course, and the detriment of other identities and languages. This leads to one aspect, or if you like, dimension of massified compulsory education. Now, the real problem, okay, by the middle and towards the end of the 1800s was child labor, chimney sweeps, children working in sweatshops in England. And the problem was that these children were, they needed to be taken out of these appalling working conditions. And that's actually what informed some of the movements towards the first compulsory schools. And, you know, you can identify many different authors of this movement, the Sunday school movement in England in the 1700s. You've got here Horace Mann, the American visionary who had a strong vision for public schools. Jules Ferry, the French statesman who brought in the whole idea of a secular education, binding a nation state. Education becomes compulsory. Now, the thing to understand is this is very recent in human history. It's extremely recent. It's the end of the 1800s. And classrooms that begin to resemble what they do today, with a teacher and a whiteboard and children on benches, all having to go to school, comes into force. But of course, it's not the same for everybody in every country. The plight of the serfs in Russia is met with the Bolshevik Revolution, which leads to Soviet state education. And of course, you've got colonization. So Macaulay, famously in his minute on Indian education in 1835, says quite explicitly that the purpose of education is to uproot Indians from Vedic culture and to give them a new narrative, which is the English narrative. So there's actually education by design here to deculture a population for colonial purposes. So the idea of a compulsory education and access to education is problematic. And the colonization of Africa, for example, really happens through the imposition of language and forms of schooling that might have started with missionary schools, but really became colonial imposition very quickly. Fast forward to 1944, you've got the GI Bill. Now, this is important because it heralds the huge economic expansion that the Western world experienced after World War II, and a period of growth that really accelerates into the 1970s. Access is multiplied, and the GI Bill allows university to be accessed by many more people, not just GIs, but other sectors of the population. And so you have a massification of university access. And some would argue that that's actually become a problem. There are about 20 million students in the US. And a conservative journalist, Harry Lambert, he writes that for every student in England who got a first in the 1990s, nearly 20 do now. So there's also the idea that there's grade inflation and that the whole thing sort of become meaningless. I mean, what's the point of having a degree if everyone has one? This is the elitist perspective, that the scarcity principle is what drives value. And if you get rid of that, then why exactly should people seek degrees in the first place? And of course, massifying education, making it equal for everybody, doesn't necessarily guarantee quality. We're trying to build on a structure that was heavily elitist, an egalitarian system. And universities being overcrowded, state universities, and many other examples are symptomatic of this. And so, of course, the United Nations and its affiliated organizations came up with these initiatives to not only bring education to all, but quality education to all. So what we're looking at here is anti-elitism. Egalitarianism, it's a very modern phenomenon, really, if you look at it politically and socially. Marxism, because Marxist principles underpin a lot of anti-elitist discourses. And post-colonialism, this is the idea that we look at education with a little bit with some suspicion, because it carries a type of agenda and an ideological purpose to it. Here are some of the modern heroes, if you like, of this movement, going back to Antonio Gramsci, Marx. You've got Howard Zinn with his History of the People. You've got the Africanist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, Edward Said. These are really post-colonial authors. And Gayatri Spivak, Angela Davis, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, they're still with us today. Feminism, post-colonialism, deconstructing elitist systems. Then, of course, COVID comes along, which is well, a bit of a problem, because what it does is it basically exacerbates elitism. Okay, now the first thing we noticed is what the digital divide was and is, and what that's meant for children because of COVID. An important movement that's taking place and started before COVID, but is continuing, it's the Roads Must Fall movement, which is, it's a plea not only to decolonize the curriculum, but to really dismantle what's seen as a patriarchal, elitist, primarily white power structure in educational systems. You've also got the Me Too movement, which again, goes back some years now, but it's picked up steam. So these are some of the forces that are at work in the world that we're living in today. And yet we're still stuck in this massified, clunky system that just in so many ways doesn't seem to work. Disparities in wealth are greater than they have ever been. Now, that's a complicated statement to make, because the poor are more or less, if you're going to sort of massify the term poverty and the poor, might be richer than they were several decades ago. Obviously, access to all sorts of things like, medicine, knowledge is much greater. But we know that inherited wealth has stripped away from those trying to access wealth, to the point that our children, Gen Z, are going to have a really difficult time trying to access wealth if they don't already have wealth. And what you're really left with is what's called the gilded path. So what is the gilded path? Well, it's complex. It starts not just at birth, possibly before birth. And I'm not talking about genetics. I'm talking about literally the baby in the womb hearing elaborate code before it's even born. Dinner time conversations about politics, the economy, literature, opera, and art. Enough money to go to a private school and therefore to access a top university. We know that legacy students in Harvard stand about a 40% greater chance of others. And that, of course, will lead to middle class, maybe even sort of leading income bracket power families that will continue this virtuous cycle of wealth. And there's also what we call the Matthew effect, which is that it actually intensifies. And through generations, this gilded path becomes even more golden. And on the other side, of course, you've got the vicious cycle of poverty, where it's incredibly difficult to break out of national systems that are heavy, that don't allow for the type of privatized pathway that elitism does. We know that efforts to do away with this, such as grammar schools, they don't actually add that much value. It's a fascinating series of pieces of research that I looked at in a lot of detail that show that, public schools, grammar schools, a lot of private schools, they're not adding that much academic value. If you start to control for things like social background, okay, many of them are selective in the first place, which is what has led to this craze of value-added testing in the UK. It's ready to sort of argue why you should pay so much money for certain schools. So why is it that people are willing to pay so much money to get into the gilded path? Well, it's the social network, okay? It's the club. And who can blame people for wanting to survive in this extremely coarse post-COVID world that's more and more separated? So what can we do about it? Well, what I argue in this book is that we can reconcile quality and access, and it's being done in some countries already. Stronger state education is the first answer, clearly. You look at a country like Switzerland, you've got an incredibly robust tax system, you've got a strong education system, excellent technical education and professional pathway, free university, even for foreigners, very low unemployment. But on the whole, countries aren't investing more than between 4 to 6% of GDP in education. Is that really enough if education is as important as we say it is? The second is the idea of scholarship programs. So that's to accelerate entry to what we could call elitist structures for children who don't have the means. And obviously this is good, individual by individual. But you might argue that that's sort of fueling a system that's more or less dysfunctional and not making substantive change. So they're fors and against. State-private mergers, that's something to look at. So how can we embrace this challenge through well-endowed elite private institutions working hand in hand with public education? And public education in the broader sense, not in the English sense. Cheaper private schools. I mean, where cheaper private schools has really taken off, it's in Kenya and to a lesser extent in India. The idea being that some of the quality that's associated with private schools, and I was talking about academic value added, not necessarily being one of them, but things like better guidance counseling, smaller class sizes, the social environment that parents prefer. This is possibly something that is going to lead to change. There's a whole movement of decolonizing the curriculum, which is a separate presentation. But that addresses this idea of cultural elitism. For how long can we carry on with this canon that really comes from one part of the world only? And finally, there's maybe the idea of changing high school transcripts. In other words, looking at what we expect of students in all school systems a little bit differently. Because the problem is, when we focus on literacy and numeracy, these pillars of education since the dawn of time, what we see is that they actually are predicting social background more than anything else. Let me explain. Children who've grown up with elaborate social code, who have literate parents, they clearly have an accelerated entry into literacy and they have more support at home. Even mathematics, okay, which is not a discussion you'll be having at home and should be need blind. It suffers from this because quite a lot of research has shown that wealthier parents have more confidence in the mathematical ability of their children, and there's more of a sort of fatalism and less confidence. So that whole attitude to learning, a learning which is enshrined in literacy and numeracy and academic skills, needs to be opened up so we can reward different types of competences, different types of profile. And that will create a more inclusive school system and possibly allow to break away from a central element of what the problem is, if you ask me, in elitism in education. Just like to thank a few people. Abdel Jalil Akari in the University of Geneva. They've been extremely supportive with this work. I'd like to thank Emily, Swapnil, Will, Daniela, and the whole team at Routledge. A number of my colleagues from the International School of Geneva, Anders Elf, Alex Rodriguez, Maura Wernz, Sanju Sharma, Michael Curie, Angie Kretzmeyer, Veronica Newington, Nick Hannell, Alison Murray. They helped me with some of the proofing of this book, as did Jeff Thompson, my master and commander, and Paul Ellis from Cambridge. Thank you for their help. My family, Estelle, my wife, Eloise, my daughter, Melchior, my son, my father, Jeff, my stepmother, Tish, and my brother, Octavius. In fact, the book is dedicated to Octavius, who is a principal at Itembela Bantu School in Cape Town. And last, but certainly not least, my friends, my colleagues, my partners, thank you for coming to this online book launch. Thank you for your support, and I very much hope that you enjoy